Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event, Gaza Life Under Siege. Our session today will discuss the current situation facing Palestinians in Gaza, the violence exercised against Gaza, stories of Palestinian martyrs and the lived experiences of their families, as well as mental health issues for survivors. We will also discuss what can be done to support Gaza as it continues to struggle against Israeli aggressions and blockade. We have 3 speakers for today. And our first speaker is Issam Adwan, who is a journalist and writer from Gaza. He is the former project manager for We Are Not Numbers, a collective of Palestinian youth in Gaza telling the human stories behind the numbers in the news. In 2019, Issam was chosen by the Carter Center to be the first young Palestinian independent international observer for the Tunisian elections. Our second speaker is Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who is a US-Palestinian journalist and author. He is the editor of Palestine Chronicle and has authored 5 books, including My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Stories. His books have been translated into several languages, including French, Turkish, Arabic, Korean, and Malayalam, among others. He previously served as head of Al Jazeera English's Research and Studies Department. Our third speaker is Marwa Hamdan, medical doctor, internal medicine trainee at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals. Marwa has obtained a master's in child and adolescent mental health, as well as a master's in psychiatric research from the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience from King's College London. Welcome all. This session will be taking rounds of questions, and I'd like to start with Dr. Baroud. People sometimes think of Palestine in terms of Gaza and the West Bank only. Can you perhaps contextualize Gaza in relation to historic Palestine and the history of the Palestinian cause?
Right. So first of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation, for all the work that, the fantastic work that you do at the university, and for including me in this conversation. I actually looked at this question. I'm trying to reflect on what would be the best way to tell the story of Palestine. If I have, and I do, I've been told that I have 3 to 5 minutes to answer this question. How do I utilize them correctly and do the story some justice? And then I came to the conclusion the best way to tell this story is to tell you very briefly about my grandfather. My grandfather, Muhammad, was a peasant. He lived in a village called Beit Daras in southern Palestine. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that he had the easiest of life. To the contrary, he had a very difficult life, and he was quite poor, and he had a small plot of land that he cultivated and worked very hard to make a good life for him and his family. Nearby my village of Beit Daras, there was a colony called Tivu or Taibe. It was a Jewish Zionist colony. It was financed by some rich guy in the UK. And the people in that colony lived more or less side by side with the people of Beit Daras. My grandfather, my grandmother, the people of the village did not make a big deal out of it. They did not really fully understand that this is part of some kind of a colonial ambition. And at one point, Taibi is going to raise its arms and Aussies against the people of Beit Daras, and eventually they will ethnically cleanse them out of Beit Daras. That's precisely what happened. I feel like my grandfather, every time he told us that story, he felt not angry only at losing his land and his village, but also angry at the feeling of betrayal, because he was a friend of some people in that village. And he used to say that they spoke our language. They were just like us in so many different ways. Well, think of that as a microcosm of the entirety of the Palestinian tragedy. My grandfather Muhammad, my grandmother Zainab were only 2 of nearly 1 million Palestinians who were eventually pushed out of their villages, of their towns, throughout historic Palestine. And they were forced to live a life of destitute as refugees in Gaza, internally displaced in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Jordan, and of course, all over the world. My grandfather lived his entire life in a refugee camp in Gaza called Nusayrat. In the refugee camp of Nusayrat, it was the largest in terms of size, the second largest in terms of population. That's really where hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees lived after Israel was established on the ruins of ethnically cleansed and destroyed Palestine. His entire life, he wanted to go back. And he believed that there is such a thing as international justice. The world will never allow this to carry on forever, he used to say. Sadly, he died in the camp and he was buried. My father fought the same fight of my grandfather, and he also died under siege in Gaza, was buried in the same refugee camp, in the same graveyard, and so forth. And now many members of my family, several generations, are buried in that exact same graveyard, and I'm carrying on with that same fight, and my children will do so. It's so important that we do not think of Gaza as an isolated event, and that we do not think of the siege as something that happened when Hamas and Fatah had their clash after the elections and so forth and so on. This is a very selective way of telling history that is really meant intentionally to bury the unity of the Palestinian collective, the unity of the Palestinian political discourse, and the continuity of the Palestinian suffering from prior to 1948 until this day. It is the same story. We are the same people. We are suffering under the yoke of the same enemy, but we are also fighting as one unified Palestinian unit, whether we are in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Palestine 48, or in any other part of the world. And I think it's very important that we insist on this context, this unified context of the Palestinian struggle.
Thank you, Ramzy, and thank you for telling the story of your grandfather. Before moving on to Issam, I'd like to remind our audience that you can send questions, and you can do that by texting the account named questions on the chat box if you have any questions that we can ask later in the session. Issam, discussions on mainstream Western media often talk about Palestine, Israel, in terms of a conflict. The reality, however, is entirely different. Can you give us an insight into that?
Yeah, definitely. Remarking what Dr. Ramzy started with, such a propaganda that started even before the days of Nakba and until this moment is the coloring of the case of Palestine as a means of conflict or being anti-Semitism. We have been facing a huge propaganda of billions of dollars until this very moment that it's a conflict. Talking on the concept of conflict, not to mention the fact, not to mention the historical facts, but talking on the days about the conflict. Is there a symmetrical power between Hamas or between the political parties or resistant parties in Israel? Talking about the casualties until this very moment, even before the armed resistance of Palestinians, we're talking about hundreds of massacres that Israel committed. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed and still are, being killed because of Israel. And talking about the future, they will be killed because of Israel. And what is the equation between, and what is the numbers between the Palestinians and the Israelis? The Israelis are closely to zero. So in a statistical fact, there is no equivalence. There is no symmetrical powers between the Palestinian resistance and the Israeli occupation. Israel has been funded by the US administration of $3.4 billion. So what equation that we are facing, and what propaganda by the Western media that we have been facing so far? The coloring of the anti-Semitism, that this is an establishment of a Jewish community, of a Jewish country, and such coloring is actually damaging the actual facts of what happens in Palestine, which is a continual genocide of Palestinians and Palestinian identities, uprooting of entire villages that were wiped out of the map. And still it's happening nowadays in Sheikh Jarrah, nowadays in many Palestinian villages. So the Nakba unfortunately continues, and the killing of Palestinians still continues under the umbrella of fighting the Jewish community and the establishment of the so-called Israel. So those facts leading us to think how the Western is contributing. They are the reason behind this existence. They are the reason behind the existence of the Palestinian suffering, of the Palestinian Nakba. They're the reasons of manipulating the Western communities and the Western media stream. So until this very moment, we're talking about billions of dollars that Israel, that is supported to Israel to propagate, or to, let's say, to promote that Israel is a country of Jews and we are trying to live in peace. There is no such peace that the Palestinians has been, I would say the Palestinians have been offered so far. The two-state solution, there is nothing were offered to Palestinians on an actual basis that Palestinians can live in peace and dignity. The Jews, the discrimination of Jews, and I would say, around the world, they wanted to end the discrimination of Jews. They wanted to end after the Holocaust. And one of the few places that Jews were not being slaughtered, including the Middle East, is Palestine. Jews, Christians, Muslims used to live in Palestine before the existence of the state of Israel. This comes to a conclusion that now the Arab population are not the Arab populations, the minorities of Muslims nowadays inside Israel, they are not needed. They're considered as a second-class citizens. Still, the Western community fails to describe this properly, that it's a conflict. What conflict on earth? While in the latest, for instance, in the latest aggression on Gaza, 11 days, and we're talking about half $500 million of physical damage that done to Gaza. Tens of people died, including children and women. So what actually the Western community is trying to depict in this manner? Are Palestinians are terrorists? Unfortunately, Palestinians have been depicted over the media stream as two sides. First, as being terrorists, second, as being victims. And actually victimizing the Palestinian narrative is also a problem, that we are only depicted as people died, people injured, and homes demolished, bombs dropped, and so on and so forth. We have never been depicted as human beings, people with hopes, aspirations of a better future, people trying to live, merely to live. And this is the kind of resistance that the Palestinian narrative has been losing so far. And it's so unfortunate that we are trying to resist, to fight for actual facts that should be spread about the Palestinians and the Palestinian narrative. This is a daily life struggle of Palestinians, that they have to prove first that they are human beings, which is so unfortunate that until 2021, until today, still there are people who should attempt to prove that they are human beings after all. And we're not freedom fighters. We are not people trying to resist whatsoever, trying to hold guns to fight for freedom. Of course, this is the right for everybody. But to understand my suffering as a Palestinian, a 28-year-old young man, before you understand my cause of suffering, you have to see me as people suffer first. If you don't, trust me, there is no words on earth in any language would describe my suffering, and it would be sufficient for you to understand.
Thank you, Issam. I think it's very useful what you said about the intentional conflation between Zionism and Judaism, also the complex representations of Palestinians in the media, either as helpless victims, no agency whatsoever, or really terrorists. Thank you. I'd like to move on to Marwa and just ask about the current situation in Gaza. Marwa, as a medical doctor from Gaza, can you tell us about the health system crisis in the Gaza Strip, the lack of equipment and medications? Can you explain the devastating impact the last Israeli aggression has had on medical staff, hospitals in Gaza?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sarah, for the question. And thank you all for attending this event, having me as a speaker as well. It's a pleasure. Actually, when we talk about healthcare system in Gaza, as the previous two speakers started to explain, we are not only talking about the start of the long-lasting blockade, which has been imposed in Gaza back in 2006 or 2007. We are talking about overstretched healthcare system and chronic impact and negative impact and effect on Gaza. We should not start from 2007, although we focus on talking about this period after Hamas took over Gaza, because situation has been really declining and being more worse than ever, or than comparatively or comparing to previous situation. If I'm going to speak about the healthcare system, I'd like just to give a brief information about Gaza for those who don't probably know much about Gaza as a geographical area. So it is this small coastal area, which is highly dense by over 2 million people are resident in Gaza. And this might give us a picture about how the medical supply in Gaza are really lacking and doesn't really supply or doesn't equate the high demand of mental health or different health services in Gaza. In fact, the recent escalations has really devastating effect on healthcare system in general. If we are about to talk about different aspects on how healthcare system has been affected, we should probably start from the chronic electricity shortages, chronic power shortages. We all know that since 2007, the major power plant has been targeted by Israeli offensives during the first war in Gaza in 2008. So this has affected hospitals and the healthcare centers very negatively and heavily. Many hospitals are reliable on the backup generator rather than the this small shortage or this insufficient shortage of power. Imagine a hospital which is at risk of power cut at every moment or every minute. So this is devastating for many supplements and many medical supplements, and this puts the patients at high risk. The other aspect that I want to speak about is the movement. It carries or it applies to the movement restriction generally in Gaza Strip. So there is lack of access to medical services outside Gaza. In fact, many have been denied the request to leave Gaza to seek advanced medical care. So all of us might know that medical care might be not all aspects of medical care are supplied and provided in Gaza, and many will need to be sent outside Gaza, specifically to Israel or West Bank. So for example, if you need a specific surgery, or if you need advanced medical therapy, for example, chemotherapy or transplantation, you will need to be sent to Israel. And Israel has been imposing many restrictions about acceptance or giving permission to people to seek medical service outside Gaza. So in terms of numbers, if we want to talk about numbers, there have been a decline in the percentage of approval of Israeli permission for cases to leave Gaza. So starting or comparing when the siege has been imposed in Gaza in 2007, the percentage of requests which have been approved by Israel fall from 90% to about 69% in just 1 year, after 1 year of the siege which has been imposed in Gaza. And further after 2007 and 2014, it has fallen further to about 55%, and there have been different figures, worsening figures thereafter. It is not only about the lack of access to medical service outside Gaza. It is also, as Sarah mentioned, about the lack of medical supplement, lack of medical equipment, and even essential drugs and essential medications which are needed by Gazans. So there are severe lack of many essential medications. For example, I was just scrolling through social media today, and I found a post by a desperate dad who was asking one of the travelers through Rafah crossing to bring him an essential medication, an anti-epileptic medication for his son. And it was like he was very desperate to the point that he was saying, please, if anybody can bring me this medication, I can pay for him whatever the cost for the medication. Imagine the burden on the dad who is trying to secure such medication, which is considered essential. We're not talking about fancy medication like nutritional supplements or something like that. It's a medication to treat epilepsy or to treat seizure, which is basic and chronic medical condition. We are also talking about direct targeting of Israeli offensives to different clinics, different hospitals, and even the medics. So if we are talking about the recent escalation, it has been reported that about 8 or 6 hospitals, and many clinics have been targeted by Israeli missiles and airstrikes. And the sad news which came from Gaza in May about the murder of one of the prominent medics in Gaza, Dr. Issam Adwan. So this doctor, I know him personally, and I really was saddened by the news of him being killed by the Israeli missiles. So he was one of the prominent medical consultants. He was one of the prominent clinical instructor who was responsible for supervising clinical training for both medical students and even the training resident doctors. He was also the lead for COVID response, and he was killed sadly by all his family members by a missile that has targeted his house in the recent escalation. Just one of his son has survived. There are many medics and many health workers who have been targeted by Israeli escalation, Israeli airstrikes. So it is honestly a healthcare crisis, and the healthcare system is really negatively and heavily impacted by the situation in Gaza, and we need urgent action to be taken in this regard.
Thank you, Marwa. Thank you. Ramzy, I have a question for you. Issam has just told us about how mainstream media in the West talks about Palestine and how different the reality really is compared to these media representations. How do people in the West see Gaza? What do they think of Palestinians in Gaza? And has this really changed over the years?
I mean, in a way it has, and yet it hasn't. And I think sometimes we are ourselves as Palestinians and pro-Palestinians kind of contribute to certain misperceptions of Gaza. And we do it out of love for Gaza, out of the sense of urgency that exists in Gaza. I mean, listening to Dr. Marwa right now is just a proof of that. There is an urgent need, there is an urgent reality. People are literally dying as a result of the lack of basic medications, let alone cancer medicine that has been used as the carrot and stick of the Israeli government for many years. You can't neglect that. You can't say, well, this is, it's the spirit of the people is far more, far more consequential than all these things and so forth. That's important. But on the other hand, yes, but people are actually at the end of the day are dying. Yes, we say it's not this is not a humanitarian conflict per se. It's a political conflict and it has historical roots. But there is a humanitarian aspect of it, where people are dying in their thousands. So how do you kind of reconcile both of these issues? I remember last time I was allowed to enter Gaza was in 2012. And I after that, I was not allowed back, not from the Israelis, but rather from the Egyptians. So I was sitting at this cafe shop where I was looking at a store downtown Gaza City. And the shop had all these posters, some very old posters, paper posters, and some new posters, and pictures upon pictures, some being peeled off, others are quite fresh. Now, if you are from Gaza, you are familiar with this scene. Whenever people want to celebrate something, you have a poster in the street. Someone goes to pilgrimage in Mecca, you congratulate the family by putting the picture of the Hajj and the Hajj all over the neighborhood. Someone has a newborn, you celebrate that. Someone graduated from college, you also celebrate that. But almost the exact same kind of poster is also for families that have been perished throughout Israeli wars. This martyr and his wife, this mother and her children, they're all dressed up in their finest clothes, and they choose the best of photos. So sometimes it's really difficult to tell which one is a newborn and which one was a martyr, which one went to Mecca or which one graduated and which one was killed by Israel. And that particular scene really just got me thinking about how Gaza processes its pain and how it has an answer. You know, the issue that we are still struggling with, trying to reconcile the various and the multiple and overlapping realities of Gaza with how we want to present Gaza to the world. I feel like the Palestinians in Gaza themselves have already resolved this riddle. And the way they did is that they managed to find a way in which life and death kind of overlap and interact. And it's just they found a way to deal with their tragedy, with their suffering, with their pain. They process it in a way that allows them to carry on, because they, at the end of the day, when the mosque and the church and the residential house and the offices and have been destroyed, they have to get up in the morning and they have to rebuild. In fact, another incredible phenomenon I notice in Gaza, because the Israelis do not allow cement to be brought into the besieged strip, Palestinians take the concrete of the destroyed building, crush it into fine powder, and use it to rebuild the same building. And it's just incredible, their will to survive, their innovation, their ability to find creative ways that would allow them to carry on with their dignity, you know, for as long as they have. But again, I think it's so important that we do not mix between the will and the spirit of the people of Gaza and neglect the fact that they are indeed in great need of support and help and solidarity. We can't just count on that and just leave them to their own situation, their own suffering the way it is. We have to find a balanced way of thinking about this. And I think the change that is happening in the Western world, I think it has a lot to do with Issam's colleagues, with these wonderful young people, their voices, their presence on social media, despite the fact that we know that they are under a constant war by social media to silence them. But it is them who is able to convey the reality from the ground, using their own voices, speaking not on behalf of anybody, but speaking on behalf of themselves as people whose positions in Gaza allows them to speak about the reality of Gaza the way the world should understand it. And I think these kind of unique, genuine Palestinian experiences, whether coming from the Gaza Strip or coming from Sheikh Jarrah, you know, Muhammad al-Kurd, Mun al-Kurd, and so forth, and numerous such activists are really trying to push a new way of thinking about Palestine. Not something that's purely academic, not something that's purely political, not something that's purely humanitarian. It's a mix between all of these things. It's the real human voice with the real genuine voice. And these are the people that we need to continue to support if we indeed want to see the ongoing change that's happening in the Western perception towards Gaza, towards the rest of Palestine to continue. We have seen that in May of this year. It was absolutely incredible. It took many of us by surprise that nobody was judging Gaza anymore. Nobody was judging the resistance anymore. Mainstream voices were lashing out at Israel. And I think it has a lot to do with the incredible work that's being done by Palestinians on the ground.
Thank you, Ramzy. A gentle reminder that you can ask us questions in the chat box by texting the account questions. I think it's also important to emphasize what Ramzy has just been saying. I think it's very tricky to like not romanticize the resilience of Palestinians in Gaza and not to get carried away with that narrative, but also to not dehumanize and not to look at Palestinians in Gaza as just, you know, hopeless victims who are unable to resist. And I think it's a fine line and something that we need to be careful about. Issam, as an activist and journalist from Gaza, can you tell us about the humanitarian situation there in terms of poverty, unemployment rates, especially in the last 15 years?
Yeah, of course. Sharing those facts will be absolutely devastating. So let's try to imagine a place of land of 365 square kilometers where 2 million people are living, with an absolute policy for the past 15 years, with an absolute policy to suffocate every norms of a human being's existence on the medical level, economic level, humanitarian level, even employment level, anything that could shape a human being's existence. And this place, this very small place, has been slashed, drained with hundreds of thousands of bombs, which costs also billions of dollars. And 2008, hundreds of people died, thousands of people injured. Another war, 2012, hundreds of people died, thousands of people injured, hundreds of homes demolished, bombed. It happened again in 2014, same statistics almost, and maybe more, because the 14th war was the longest one. And finally, 2021, the latest aggression on Gaza during May. Also, people died, and hundreds of them were injured, and slaughtered. Entire families were wiped out of the civil registry from Gaza. So this place has been subjected to a very harsh humanitarian situation, crisis. I would describe crisis that is increasing crazily day by day, which is affecting the poverty rate, affecting the unemployment rate, affecting the economics of the place, affecting the medical, as Dr. Marwa stated, affecting every norm, even to the levels of the mental health. We're talking about the majority of population, if not all of them, because unfortunately there is no statistical identification for the PTSD, for instance. I myself went into therapy many times because of the horrific scenes that I have witnessed as a journalist, because luckily they were not my family, they were not my relatives, but every story matters. As long as I'm witnessing those shattered bodies of children, as long as I'm seeing those mothers losing their children, including those mothers lost themselves, and those fathers are crying out loud because they lost their entire families. During the 11 days, the last aggression on Gaza, the 11 days, the massacres that Israel committed in Al-Wahda Street, 4 families entirely wiped out of the civil registry in Gaza. Dr. Marwa named some of them. Al-Kolik family, where 22 members of the family were slaughtered. Abu al-Auf family, Shkuntana family, and the list goes on. So this place has been subjected to all these horrific scenes, and not only those that we are mentioning, the dates of 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021, including those years of how the Western media is depicting. They are absolutely ignoring that we are dying amid them. We are dying day by day because of the lack of food. Many people dying because they are unemployed. Many people died because, as Dr. Marwa stated, that they are denied their medical permits to go to be treated in Palestinian hospitals inside the Palestinian territories. Still, they are denied. The majority of my population, because we are being too young for the Egyptian administration, borders administration, 90% of my generation are denied to go through even the Egyptian borders, and we have to pay a bribe In short, it's like amount of money that we're paying the Egyptian administration to make the coordination needed. It's a coordination, but it's in fact, it's a bribe. And there are so many things that I can't even think of, because to me, living 28 years of my life, my entire life, living in those circumstances, I have a bit of being used to those harsh circumstances at the moment that I felt they are just normal things. And my mind cannot really analyze them, that they are abnormal. They shouldn't happen to anybody. They shouldn't happen to me. I shouldn't feel that they are normal. Those are the circumstances that we have been subjected to so far. Some people, as I said before, some people are dying because they can't find food. Scientists have expected the Gaza Strip to be unlivable by 2020, and now here we are, 2021. The majority of the water is present in Gaza, undrinkable. And we are importing almost everything from Israel, and we're denied to do that from other countries, of course, because there is a policy of Israel that is denying the imports of different countries, unless those materials that Israel is sure will not be used for weapons or missiles or whatsoever, even for absurd reasons. Those are the harsh realities that we're living. I personally granted several scholarships to travel abroad, and I was denied. The only moment that I was accepted to travel outside, more than traveling to Egypt by foot or by car, I was allowed to go to Tunisia because the invitation came through the Carter Center. The Carter that is funded and supported by the former president of the US, Jimmy Carter. And I had the privilege to go there because the invitation came through them. It's ironic, but it's reality. 99% of my generation, they are denied for really silly reasons under the umbrella of, let's say, claiming that it's for security reasons. What security reasons could be caused by a teenager, 19 years old, 20 years old, who is going or she is going to seek, for instance, an education for a scholarship or something like this? What a security measurement that Israel is doing to forbid children to go for medication, to be treated inside Palestinian hospitals, inside the Palestinian territories. Those are the facts that we have been living with almost our entire lives, and to the levels that we consider them normal. Our minds stopped analyzing them as those, crises, because we have to get up every day in the morning. We have to keep going. We have to attempt finding jobs. We have to establish families because there is no alternative. Either we die slowly, and this is actually the equation that Israel has been imposing on Palestinians, especially on the Gaza Strip since 2006 to 2007, which is either you people in Gaza, you accept the slow death policy, or you are responding in an act of anger. During the Great March of Return, we protested peacefully, bare souls and bodies, or we shot some rocks over the border, the eastern borders or the northern borders of Gaza. We are throwing rocks, or we are protesting, or whatsoever. Then we are facing a fatal death, a rain of bombardment launched on Gaza for continuous days. This is the equation that we have to live up with, and we have to live up with, because this is continuing. And whatever Gaza is doing, whatever Palestinians are doing in the Western media, we will be always blamed. We will be always depicted as terrorists. We are throwing rocks from 10 kilometers, for instance. We will be shown as aggressive, a threat to the Israeli state. We are responding with the handmade rockets, and it's really exaggeration to call them rockets, and they do not even kill anybody. Still, we are depicted as terrorists. We are protesting bare souls and bodies at the eastern borders during 2018, 2019, 2020. Still, the Western media depicted us as people trying to breach the fence, which is illegal fence in the first place, that we're trying to breach the fence to go to slaughter the Jews inside the Israeli state. And this is the absolute equation we have to live up with. Either we are accepting to die slowly, or we are acting in a self-defense and we are dying really fast. And the devastating fact, as somebody from Gaza, and I have lots of knowledge on the stories and the people of Gaza, I can tell you many people would prefer to die quickly because they cannot really witness their children die before their eyes because they don't have jobs and they can't secure, food and water for them. Some of them will even imagine themselves dying or will even beg for themselves to be killed or something like that because at some point it's pointless for them. So people are not only suffering those facts that I just mentioned, they are also suffering, which is very, very devastating, that people are suffering the lack of hope. People are helpless and hopeless. They don't know how to get up every morning and to act that it's a normal life. They are trying to do so, but they can't do so. Simply, they can't do so. I have been privileged in so many ways with a supported family, with several jobs, with proper education, which the majority of people of Gaza, they are not having similar circumstances. That's why I'm always insisting, don't consider me as the voice of Gaza in any webinar or in any talk. Yes, I'm sharing those facts and I'm sharing those stories, but my presence is not a representative, is not a fine representative of their suffering. I am suffering. I am dehumanized on so many levels, but to the levels of witnessing my children dying before my eyes, I believe those people deserve to take the chance to be recognized as people suffering. At first, since we're talking about the scale of suffering, they are the people suffering the most.
Thank you, Issam. Thank you. Marwa, I'd like to ask you, during Israeli aggressions and times of escalation, Palestinians in Gaza suffer from, especially children, suffer from mental health disorders. As a mental health specialist, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. In terms of mental health, situation is really complex. And when we talk about mental health in Gaza, we are actually talking about what we call ongoing trauma rather than just a single event of trauma. So if we want to speak about the recent escalation, it is not only the recent escalation or the latest Israeli offensive, which has brought PTSD or even traumatic symptoms or other high rates of mental health conditions in Gaza. It is the generation of the trauma and the ongoing trauma, and we shouldn't also forget about the historical Palestine and the history about Palestine. So it doesn't start from the imposition of, or the start of siege or the blockade, which has been imposed in Gaza back in 2007 or 2006. It has started before that with the Israeli occupation. As a clinician or as a medical doctor who has background in mental health, we can speak about the major mental health condition. Probably most of us know about the PTSD or the post-traumatic stress disorder, which is probably the major topic or the major vocab which arise in our mind when we talk about mental health in Gaza, because of this full-scale war. So we talk about 4 wars in less than 15 years. So if we want to study the situation in Gaza, these wars have been classified by the United Nations as full-scale wars. It is not only just a brief escalation or brief violence, or as the Western media sometimes like to call it, as a fight or conflict between Hamas and Israel. It is a full-scale wars, which has like 4 of them that happened in just short period, 15 years or less than 15 years actually. So imagine a child, or imagine any person who has been witnessing, for example, a murder of family members in front of his eyes, or he has been even hearing the bombardment all the day, all the time during 11 consecutive days in the last offensive, or he has been also having or living the consequences of the war and the offensive. It is not only about the war and escalation itself. So if we want to talk about probably figures or statistics, according to the WHO, it has been estimated that about 37% of adults in Gaza can qualify for PTSD diagnosis. And when we say qualify for PTSD diagnosis, clinically, PTSD, in order to diagnose PTSD, you should have different symptoms together in order to be diagnosed as having disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. But this doesn't mean that other people in Gaza are not having other symptoms of post-trauma, or what we call post-traumatic symptoms. And one of the psychiatrists has even better called it as probably present post-traumatic disorder or ongoing, because we are talking about layers of trauma. As I said, it's not only a single incident. And in terms of children, as Sarah mentioned, these children are mostly affected and very heavily affected by trauma. Even clinically, when we talk about the symptoms in children, they are way different from adults. Children might present with very vague symptoms, and it might pose a challenge for a clinician or a psychiatrist to diagnose a child with PTSD. A child might present with really different symptoms such as hyperactivity, even bedwetting. I've worked in one of the local non-governmental organizations, the Gaza Community Mental Health Organization, and according to their figures, it was estimated that 11% of children visiting the centers of Gaza Community Mental Health Program are having bedwetting, and bedwetting can be a symptom of different anxieties or even a trauma that a child has been exposed to. As we said, the percentage of adults was 37%, but in children it is much higher. It was estimated that about 55% of children qualify for PTSD diagnosis. And this is according to a study which has just conducted in 2020. It's just a year before the latest escalation. So we are talking probably about same percentage, or even if we want to speak about traumatic symptoms, not only PTSD, we are talking about higher figures. And another study, it was estimated that almost 90% of population in Gaza are affected by probably single or more than one traumatic event in their life. Even us, if you want to ask any of UK resident who has lived in Gaza at any point in their lives, so ask them, for example, if they have ever had nightmare about returning back to Gaza and being stuck in Gaza because of the closure of borders, if they have heard an airplane flying in the sky, what is the thing that comes to their mind? It is the bombardment. I myself had these thoughts and have had these nightmares when I came here to UK. So it is that because I have been exposed to these traumatic events, even if I haven't been affected directly by loss of one of my family members or so on, but these kinds of trauma has really literally affected every single person in Gaza. And it is not only about PTSD. So the consequences and the mental health condition doesn't only stop on PTSD. We are talking about different symptoms that go beyond PTSD symptom or post-traumatic stress symptoms. For example, if I want to speak about cases from the psychiatric hospital. These cases have been shared by my colleague who's right now a psychiatry resident in the only inpatient psychiatric hospital. So imagine a highly dense area serves more than 2 million people in Gaza. There is only one inpatient psychiatric hospital to serve all those people. There are, of course, other providers of mental health services, but these providers are really scattered and they are based on outpatient service. We are not telling you that outpatient service is not something good, but the thing that I wanted to highlight is that there is just one inpatient psychiatric hospital in Gaza. So if I want to give some examples about such cases, there's, for example, 20 years old girl, and I'm not here sharing any medical information for confidentiality reasons, but just to give you an insight about what kind of symptoms that we see as clinicians. So this girl has witnessed the murder of her father in front of her eyes in 2014. She is coming these days by symptoms of PTSD and symptoms that qualify for major depression disorder. So imagine that this incident has happened back 7 years ago, 7 years ago, and she's still having some symptoms of insomnia, of avoidance for places that reminds her of the incident or the trauma, flashbacks of the trauma, and she has low mood. There are probably tens or hundreds of cases, similar cases in Gaza. There are many cases of depressive symptoms among people in Gaza. So as I said, it is not only about PTSD, it's about even psychosis. And we might know about psychosis, which might be triggered by different factors, but the exposure to ongoing distress and anxiety caused by Gaza situation can really trigger psychotic symptoms in those vulnerable people or people who have been exposed to extreme hardship. I remember a case I saw when I was a medical student. So she has lost her husband, her brothers, and she had these devastating effects about that, presenting with different mental health conditions. So it is really a complex situation, and it's also about the mental health services, which is being really fragmented and scattered, and the lack of the medical equipments, again, the lack of trainees in this field as well. So it is complex and multi-layers of trauma that has been affecting Gaza and people in Gaza.
Thank you, Marwa. I think just to comment on what you said about even Palestinians who live in the UK, including myself, Marwa, and Ahmed, who organized this event, we haven't been able to visit our families in Gaza. So I've been here for 2 years and I couldn't go back to Gaza. I tried. The complexities of both borders, areas, and Rafah are just traumatizing. And that is only one single part of just what Marwa was saying. Ramzy, you have done extensive research on Gaza and Palestine. How do you think we can best tell the story of Gaza without dehumanizing Palestinians there? Ramzy, you're muted.
Indeed, I was muted. Thank you for the question. And to answer this question regarding Gaza, I think we have to apply the same question and answer to the entirety of the Palestinian narrative, Palestinian political discourse, and Palestinian reality in general. But before we talk, and I will talk very briefly about the best way to communicate Gaza to the world, and by extension Palestine, is what did we do wrong, or how was the story communicated prior to that? That was problematic, obviously, because many people for many years did not really understand what's going on. I mean, many Americans still think that Palestinians are occupying Israel. And how is that even possible? What does the mainstream media actually say that people know so little, and what they know, despite of 24 hours, international news coverage, people don't even understand the basics of what's happening in Palestine and Israel. So what went wrong in the beginning? And I think one of the issues is that Palestinians were removed entirely from their narrative. I mean, our narrative was not communicated through us at all. It was always someone else telling the story on our behalf. The Zionists told the story, carved the story out of nothing, created this illusion of a story, created this fraudulent narrative that has no historical basis whatsoever, and the vast majority of Westerners believed it. And when there were some people who began seeing things, or growing sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, began telling the story, they still did not allow the Palestinian to tell the story. So the story was told on behalf of the Palestinian. And if you're not a Palestinian, I mean, you were saying yourself just a second ago how you, Sarah, and your colleagues had to go through this. You can't visit your families. What Marwa was talking about, these are personal experiences. Yes, she's documenting numbers, but it's also her community, her family, her society, her feelings, her ideas. I mean, Issam had a lot of courage when he spoke about the therapies that he had to go through. Issam is not just a handsome face, just shows up on webinars. He's also a person who endures on a daily basis. And yes, Issam, you are a representation of the Palestinian people as well. I mean, yes, people go through different type of experiences. Some people suffer more, some people lose more, but ultimately you internalize the experience like everybody else. And so you are a representation of that Palestinian collective. But at the end of the day, it wasn't us who was telling the story. It was someone entirely different. It's always someone entirely different. You know, it's like almost, I remember I was talking to two Palestinian intellectuals, some of the best in the world, and they were telling me that they were invited to an event in which an Israeli, pro-Israeli, anti-Zionist, Israeli Jewish activist was speaking. And he said, they said, here we were sitting in the audience. The Israeli guy is telling the story on our behalf. We're just kind of just smiling and nodding our heads, even though we had a much more powerful version of that story. But they were told to sit down. Why? Because we Palestinians have learned in the West that we are a liability, you know, to ourselves. You know, if we tell our own story, God forbid, bad things will happen. So it has to be someone else who's telling that story. So I think that's what went wrong. How do we correct that naturally is by telling the story ourselves. Not by denying the others to be part of our solidarity movement, to be included in our narrative, but we have to be the central element in that narrative. The story of Palestine is the story of Palestinian resistance. And when I say resistance, I'm not talking about guns and bullets and such, but I am not excluding that either. And I'm very clear about that. You know, the woman who, you know, has to take her son to receive cancer-saving, you know, life-saving medications for cancer at some Israeli checkpoint in Gaza or anywhere in the West Bank for that matter, and has to go there time and again. In order for her to save her son's life, she is a resistor. She is a fighter. Every Palestinian has a capacity, and many of whom are actually using that capacity to resist. The artist is resisting, the fighter is resisting. Every Palestinian, by putting a smile on your face in front of your own kids and behaving that everything is going to be okay during the times of war and genocide, that is a form of resistance. Resistance manifests itself in numerous ways. When the mosques in Gaza were destroyed during the last war, and people went and they prayed on top of the rubble or near the rubble of their destroyed mosques, that's an act of spiritual resistance. All of these are acts of resistance. So to celebrate Gaza, to tell the story of Gaza, to communicate Gaza correctly, we have to communicate the story of resistance in all of its manifestation. And to do that, then you are not telling the story of Mahmoud Abbas. You're not telling the story of, you know, VIP card holders in Ramallah. You know, you are telling the story of ordinary people. But here's the incredible thing. I mean, I say the word ordinary people, but I'm being like, yeah, they are ordinary, but are they really ordinary? I mean, they are extraordinary in their ordinariness, if that's even a term. They live an extraordinary life. They are not even aware of it at times, because they are, maybe in their mind, they're just trying to survive, maybe in their minds that. But in actuality, if you tell these stories of ordinary people and bring them all together somehow, you have an extraordinary and a powerful story of Palestine. We have to tell that story. And that's what I've really been trying to do. In fact, I did my PhD in people's history of Palestine, because I am sick and tired of the academic narrative. I'm tired of the elitist narrative on Palestine. With all due respect to all the great leaders of Palestine, the story of Palestine is not the story of factions. and leaders and individuals is the story of ordinary people. How do we do that without dehumanizing, but without exaggerating to the point that we just pretend that everything is good and dandy, because it's not. So you just communicate the narrative of the people, their strength and their weaknesses, their moments of empowerment and resistance, and their moments of fear. Because at the end of the day, they are also human beings, and we have to communicate that without exaggerating that. Let's bring the stories all, out in the open. Let's tell the stories of every Palestinian. Every Palestinian out there, tell your own story. Don't engage in what I call the history of negation, trying to prove you are not a terrorist, trying to prove that you don't want to destroy Israel, trying to prove that, no, we are not anti-Semitic. We've been playing that game for a century. It got us nowhere. And in the process of doing so, we're actually not even telling our own story. Who are we? Hello, my name is Issam Adwan. My name is Marwa Hamdan, and this is my story. If you tell your story that way, you will defeat the Zionist narrative. Absolutely, because you will connect with people at a personal level. There is so much overlapping between us and people all over the world, from South Africa to Chile to Scotland. We are not so different as we may think we are. And the only way we can actually find that common ground with people is by telling our stories the way they are, unblemished, as real as they can be.
Thank you, Ramzy. Thank you. Issam, very briefly, as a former project manager of We Are Not Numbers, you have witnessed a lot of personal human stories behind the numbers on the news, stories of Palestinian victims of the ongoing Israeli aggressions and the repeated attacks. Can you share one of these stories very briefly?
Yeah, of course. I believe this is the proper moment maybe to salute those people that I've worked with in the last aggression of Gaza. I worked with Omar Baroud, who lost almost his entire family. I worked with Riyad Shkuntana, the father, who survived along with one of his daughters, but unfortunately he lost his wife and the rest of the family. Salute to Muhammad Al-Kulak, who survived also the massacre of Al-Kulak family, and so many others who survived the nightmare of Al-Wahda streets bombing during the 11 days of aggression on Gaza. Some of those stories, they are stories of suffering, of course, above all things. They are stories of loss, stories of suffering, but some of them, they are, in my few words that I can describe, they are miracles of courageousness, bravery, and resilience. I don't really tend to entitle them to those positive, words, but they are so to me and to many others in Gaza Strip, as well as to the Western world, that we're not telling those stories and we're not sharing those stories to feel sympathy about them and to feel sympathy about their loss, but also to learn how they have been resilient towards those sufferings, and they are still capable of loving the life and one would like to keep going. One of the stories that I've started 3 years ago during the Great March of Return is the story of the cycling champion, Ala Dali. You can Google his name. He was a cyclist. He was expected to go to Tokyo to participate in the Olympics, a finest representation of a young man, a dreamer, champion above all things. But unfortunately, he participated the 13th of March, the establishment, the very first day of the Great March of Return. And from 900 meters away from the fence, he was directly shot in the knee of the right foot, and he lost his leg. He lost his dream, he lost his life. That was closely like 75 kilos person. But once he was shot, he lost, of course, his leg, but he tended to be like 42 kilos. He lost almost lost his life. He spent like 2 months in hope that, like 2 weeks at the beginning of the injury, he spent 2 weeks in severe, surgeries trying to save his leg. He applied to several permits, including, of course, at the very early days to travel to the West Bank to be treated in a Palestinian hospital. But of course, because he's a young man, he was denied. And because of the lack, as Dr. Marwa stated, because of the lack of the medical equipment and medical expertise and experience as well, they couldn't help the leg to survive. So he lost his leg at the end of the day. I personally worked so hard trying to get close to him as a person, as a friend, as somebody who cared about him and above all things. And I have witnessed utterly a miracle of somebody getting up after 2 months of losing his leg, regaining his strength, his weight. And all of a sudden, I just saw him training again. And I asked him, before anything done on a media perspective, of course, I wrote his story. I was one of the people first to write Ala's story. And I used to like to visit him almost on a daily basis to check on him and try to go out, trying to get him out of the mood, because I know how devastating this could be. And to get to anybody, it doesn't matter how strong you are, at some point you're losing your dream, you will consequently think of committing a suicide or something like this. And I was very much terrified about that fact. So one day I went to check up on him and I saw him training. What are you doing? You're barely surviving. He said, okay, I didn't have the chance to represent Palestine as a cyclist. Now it's my opportunity to do it as a paracyclist. And it was, okay, I used to complain about my life and the lack of options that I had as somebody who's been, living in the besieged of Gaza Strip. But at that moment, he taught me a lesson, a very hard lesson, that never to complain, always you can seek life. And I kept preserving, I kept working on him, on his story, trying to find more opportunities for him, more people who would love to see him riding a bicycle despite his amputation. And throughout all these years, I have worked on his story for multiple international agencies, trying just to promote his name because he deserves so, not for the feeling of sympathy or feeling sad about his story. He's truly a champion utterly in how the word means. He's a champion who lost his leg, almost lost his life, but he taught everybody who witnessed his story, who watched his story. You can Google his story on YouTube. It's published also on Al Jazeera video. So it was one of the most inspirational stories that I personally influenced by. And this lesson and those lessons that Allah taught me and taught everybody, almost everybody heard about his name and read his story. He taught us never to give up. And he always saying, every interview, he always saying, I'm not gonna just sit home and allowing people to sympathize or to feel pity for me. I don't want so. I don't deserve so. I deserve to be a champion and I would like to be entitled as so. And at some point, he was denied, by the way, to go for the last Paralympics. We worked on the invitation by the Italian government and to go to Italy because we did an episode, the first episode about his story going on around in Italy and in Europe. And we wanted him to go, to be a guest, an honorable guest for the movie first, appearance. And they denied him for security reasons. And in the second episode, I told him, Allah, this rejection is definitely going to be our perspective. You are an athlete. You are a sportsman. You are an inspiration. You are a champion still. They don't see that in you. So the rejection is definitely the perspective we are targeting in the second episode, which we are currently working on. Allah is one of the few stories inspired me the most, but not to neglect. Throughout my experience with We Are Numbers for the past 5 years, I have learned that every Palestinian is a story. Every Palestinian is a hero in a way or another, in certain way, in certain perspective. And digging in those stories will teach you many lessons. This is the fact that I came up with throughout my work with We Are Not Numbers. So I don't ever hesitate to dig in any story of Palestine. And if anybody is open to share me a story as an experience, I'm certain it has plenty of lessons that the Western community, especially the Western community, could learn from. We are not asking throughout this story that I shared with you. And again, we are not that, we, the Palestinians, we're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for us to be recognized, not to be recognized. This is a normal thing that any people should be considered as people first. We want you to see us as people so you can understand our suffering. And there is no shortcuts. You can't read about the suffering, then you have to understand me as a human being. No, it's a simple equation. You have to see me as a human being to understand how I am suffering. It's a simple fact, which is the Western media and the Western communities, they are failing to understand. That is why they're only focusing on Gaza. They're always reading about Gaza whenever there are people dying, homes bombed, and wars established or happens. So what I'm telling them always, just come to talk to me about anything in life. I'm a guitar player. You have no idea. I'm trying. I used to be an English language teacher. You don't know anything about that in me. The same applies to every Palestinian that you most likely know in your lives. And I'm certain some of the people of the Palestinians of the diaspora, they are suffering the same. I traveled to Tunisia, and what they have been asking me, how is it going in Gaza? War is happening all the time. People are dying all the time. For God's sake, you should ask me about something else. Like, I'm coming out through a place that is crisis almost, but you are not curious to understand how I'm living as a human being. You only care about knowing about me as somebody who's closely dying, which is so unfortunate, of course. And I'm sorry for not being brief.
Thank you, Issam, no worries. Marwa, very briefly, I asked you in my previous question about how during Israeli aggressions and mental health situation during Israeli aggressions, I was just wondering, are people in Gaza generally less anxious, more relatively relaxed when there's a ceasefire?
Okay, sure. So if we want to compare the level of anxieties during escalation and after escalation, of course, during escalation, the level of anxieties will be much exacerbated, but that doesn't necessarily mean the Palestinians are relaxed outside these time frames of escalations or Israeli offensives. And this is reflected by the figures of mental health conditions. So we are not only talking about these levels or high rates of traumatic symptoms or even mental health conditions during escalations, but these cases are continuously visiting different mental health centers and clinics with the different psychiatric conditions as well. It is not only about PTSD, and it is not only triggered by the incident of escalation or traumatic incidents of escalation. It goes beyond that. And of course, when we talk about the siege imposed on Gaza, we talk about different consequences, psychological consequences, which is basically brought by probably the economical consequences. We know in any place that the major risk factors for developing poor mental health is poverty, unemployment. And when we talk about Gaza, we talk about high rates of unemployment, high rates or percentage of people who rely on the assistance, external assistance for their daily livings and like the daily supplies. This is very likely to affect their mental health condition. So, for example, I'll give one example of an adult of unemployment, which might give a representative picture of how people in Gaza somehow are really helpless and hopeless in terms of finding jobs or finding their way or pathway in Gaza. So this gentleman is about 24 years old. He's a lawyer, and he was supposed to be a promising lawyer. He is supposed to full his potential after graduation, getting a proper job. But unfortunately, he ended up as an inpatient in the psychiatric hospital, suffering from drug-induced psychosis. And in fact, he was presented with symptoms of aggression toward his family member, symptoms of anxiety and hallucinations, which mark the hallmark of psychosis. And then when we tracked the background, he was found to be unemployed for about 6 years, searching for a job, but unfortunately he couldn't find a job. He couldn't secure his financial needs. He's not financially independent, and he's about 25 years old, or 24, as I said. So all of this will put him on a very high burden and will put him on high risk of developing different mental health conditions. So in fact, he was unfortunately engaged in drug misuse, or like he is becoming addicted to cannabis, and thus he has developed psychosis. So I'm not telling that this case is very relevant among Gazan population, but it's just a case to show you how the hardship, economical hardship, and the situation in Gaza Strip can really bring devastating consequences, both on individual level, like the mental health level, and on the his family and his close friends or his beloved ones as well. So we are talking about a really high number of different mental health conditions, even outside the times of escalation, and not only during the escalation itself. And if we want to give different examples about these, there are tens and hundreds of people who are suffering, especially as well, again, children suffering from different symptoms. And we really need to encourage or to put this as our priority. Like the mental health condition is really deteriorating in Gaza. And probably the healthcare system should focus on this sector in order to provide the required service and to meet the demand of Gazan population.
Thank you, Marwa. We're running out of time, so we only have 10 minutes, and I'll take a couple of questions from the audience. Sorry if I miss any questions. A very quick question to Ramzy. Is the tide turning in public opinion after the latest Gaza escalation, especially with the Human Rights Watch declaring Israel is practicing apartheid? Or is change not possible until America ends its support and there are sanctions imposed on Israel by the international community?
The tide is turning. It has been turning for quite some time now. For a while, it was quite difficult to kind of demonstrate that through real examples. It's just something you feel, that the perception of Palestine is becoming different, even in mainstream media. I'm not talking about particular societies or groups that are on the fringe. I'm talking about the everyday mainstream society in Europe mostly, but also, and growingly so, in the United States. The fact, now back in the day, when I first came to this country, to the United States, just, I actually, one of my professors at the University of Washington, and I'm not gonna go into many details into that, because he met with Yasser Arafat, along with his students as part of their research trip to the Middle East. The entire department was restructured and many people got fired. The acknowledgement that there is a Palestinian leadership, a Palestinian narrative of any kind, was in itself considered an act of anti-Semitism or something that cannot be forgiven according to the diktat of mainstream society. Now, fast forward to today, the reality is really shifting in an incredible way and at an incredible rate. the fact that you have numerous mainstream personalities, politicians, celebrities, artists who are declaring solidarity with Palestine openly and yet surviving, getting re-elected. Nobody is canceling their music contracts or their tours and so forth. It shows you that the kind of impact that the Zionists had at controlling the pro-Palestine narrative, whether in the US or anywhere around the world, is fading. And the grip of the Zionists is loosening. In fact, I had an article about this published in Politics Today a couple of days ago. If you could just give me a quick second here to just mention the title, because I go through that question in absolute details. It's called Raids, Arrests, and Death Threats, Israel's Strategy of Silencing Human Rights Defenders. And in my article, I argue that Israel seems to have accepted that there is no strategy of fighting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS. There is no centralized strategy. They don't want to admit it, but everything that they have tried is failing. All the laws that they have created, the various definitions of what anti-Semitism is or is not, all of this does not seem to have really made a major impact on the way that people are interacting with the Palestinian narrative, with the BDS movement, and so forth and so on. What can Israel do at this point but to embrace the fact that it is an apartheid regime and it's going to fight for that status for as long as possible? But that's precisely what happened with South Africa. Once upon a time, there was a statement that was made by the South African government in Pretoria that we are an apartheid regime and there's nothing we are going to do to change that status. With the resistance of the people in South Africa, with the international support that accompanied that resistance, they actually managed to eventually defeat apartheid. And the same thing is going to happen in Palestine and Israel. There is no doubt in my mind about it. There is absolutely no doubt. The question is, how do we get there? How do we achieve that movement? Is by constantly keep pushing the Palestinian narrative, constantly keep supporting the Palestinian cause in every circle, in every society, in every margin, in every space that we are that we manage to obtain anywhere in the Western world, but also in the Southern Hemisphere. And that's a whole different story why this is becoming a contested space for us Palestinians. So yes, the short story, the short answer, the tide is indeed turning, but it's turning because of the machinations that are underway. And we need to continue to support these machinations in order for us to get to that point where Israel is not just exposed for being an apartheid regime, and that is happening increasingly worldwide. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Beit Salem itself, numerous rights organizations around the world are now branding Israel exactly as such. But how do we go beyond that into dismantling apartheid? And that is our biggest challenge at the
moment. Thank you, Ramzy. Actually, a quite related question before we move on to Issam, also to Ramzy. How safe, this is quite relevant to what you were just saying, but if you could elaborate, how safe can Palestinian students in the UK feel in universities with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism being accepted in many institutions? And what can be done to address this?
The issue of definitions is very much related to the issue of the Zionist push to change laws, regulations, perceptions, definitions, not just in the UK, but all over the world. Here in the US, for example, there are many legislations happening at a national level, at a state level, even at a city council level, in order for them to limit the thinking, the words, and of course, the action. There are some villages, some towns in the southern US that have been hit by hurricanes, in which people, in order for them to receive badly needed aid from the US federal government, had to sign papers that says that they do not support the boycott of Israel. People who don't even know where Israel is on a map. Now you would say, wait a minute, isn't this an indicative of the power of the Zionists globally? They can control the narrative at that localized level. Yes, you could think of it this way, but you could also think of it as a result, that this is a result of their fear. They are very scared because the nature of the conversation is shifting. The nature of the support for Palestine is changing. The language of the Palestinians and the presence of Palestinians around the world is becoming more and more present and pressing. And we are now not just being part of the conversation. In many campuses in the UK, in the US, and around the world, we actually control the conversation. So all of these things, trying to push for alternative definition, to expand the definition of anti-Semitism to include Zionism and this and that and so forth, it's all part of their fear that they are losing hold of the narrative, that they have control over Palestine since the days of old, when they came and they said Palestinians do not exist. There was no such people as Palestinians that existed when we came, and we made the desert bloom, and Palestine was a land of no people for a people with no land. I mean, they really had a completely uncontested space as far as the narrative is concerned to define Palestine and Israel in any way they wanted. And we were not even present in that conversation. Now things are changing. And because things are changing, they are becoming extremely worried, and they are going after people legally through the court system, through, threatening people with their jobs, with their livelihoods, with their receiving aid from the government, and so forth. But here's the key. We can't be weakened. We can't be scared, because this is a transition. This is a transition, and there will be a price. Some of us do pay a price, and I'm not going to go into many details about how some of us pay that price, but I know many colleagues who lost jobs and lost their incomes and lost their status, and they're been denied their degrees and so forth as a result of this. But this is the price of standing up for what is right. That's the price of standing up for what is right. And if we weaken now, we are all, so this is the last hope for Palestine internationally. We can't weaken. We have to understand that there is a price that to be exacted from us. But every revolution, every national liberation movement, the struggle for the liberation and the freedom of any nation throughout history came with a price. We have to accept that, and we have to understand that. And we have to remember that at the end of the day, what will get us to the point where we want to be, exposing Israel, dismantling apartheid, is through our unity. We have to be strong. We can't fight this as individuals. We have to fight it as collectives, regardless of where we are in the world.
Thank you. I totally agree. Issam, very quickly, we'll take this question. How do you think Israeli media and rhetoric dehumanizes the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip?
As it's also a fulfillment of the propaganda that the Western media is working on. It's the same system which the Israeli government is funding with billions of dollars to promote that the people of Gaza they are terrorists. This is a simple fact. Whether we are throwing rocks, we are shooting rockets, we are protesting peacefully at the eastern borders or the north borders of Gaza, we're always depicted as people, as terrorists. And whenever, Israel doing the harm or, raining bombs over Gaza, they're also provoking the excuse and the winning card of Israel that Hamas is the reason. But, debunking this manipulative narrative is really simple. Hamas existed in 1986. How many massacres Israel committed to Palestinians? How many hundreds, thousands of Palestinians were slaughtered, entire villages were killed, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homes and villages back in 1948, and it's still happening nowadays. So I believe it's a fulfillment of the propaganda which Israel started. Yes, Dr. Ramzy highlighted that in a very fine way, that it is really expensive for us as Palestinians to go to the level, to level up to the aspirations of the Palestinians. I would say blood that we are suffering, sweat that we are losing, and souls that we're losing almost day by day. To fit those levels is that we're exposing Israel, but exposure is not really enough. We have to keep going and to keep fighting until we are dismantling this apartheid regime. It's also one of the many things that we're always highlighting, that there are also a movement inside of Israel dismantle this apartheid regime among Jewish communities, those who are recognizing that Israel is just an apartheid regime and they are manipulative, are using the Jewish narrative as the winning card because it's internationally recognized. And this is the shifting that is happening before the Nakba, during the Nakba, until today, that it's an anti-Semitism case whenever the Palestinians are responding in a way or another. So what Israel is doing, it's just a fulfillment of where it started.
Thank you, Issam. Marwa, a very quick question. What do you think is the best treatment for children in Gaza who suffer continuous mental disorders? What do you think is the best way? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. So in terms of mental health condition, we largely, probably many of us know that it is a multifactorial condition. So we are not only, when it comes to treatment or management, there's no such like a magic management because every case is individual. But generally speaking, we should incorporate both psychotherapy, medication, and different types of psychotherapy. When it comes to children, it is very important to be specialized and to provide such psychotherapy with highly qualified professionals. And to be honest, there are a lot of psychologists in Gaza, but there is somehow lack of training. There is training that take place in Gaza by different non-governmental organizations, but these seem to be fragmented again. We need to get such services with highly professionals and also to reach those vulnerable children. So targeting the right person and choosing the specific psychotherapy which might help them the most will be the ministry of treatment. And also, to be honest, Issam has raised a very important point about the term of resilience in terms of mental health. It applies to children and it applies to adults. And I would like to touch upon the point which has been raised also by Ramzy about the narrative and how Palestinian narrative should be, because it is powerful, should be the mainstream in Western media also. We shouldn't be trying to be relatable to the Western narrative that we are terrorists or we are committing terrorist acts. In fact, when we start to speak about us as not only victims, but also as fighters or also as ones who have the right of the land and the right to resist, the right to fight. So this, in fact, may give the individual in Gaza much power and will promote the resilience. And when it comes to resilience, it is the cornerstone in healing many mental conditions. So if a person has been exposed to different trauma and this trauma is not expected to end at some point, because it is, as we said, it's an ongoing trauma. So the major issue here is to build our resilience, not to present ourselves as heroes because we are human and we are suffering, but at the same time, we are not victims and we have the right to resist. We have the right to be ourselves and to say our narrative, because our narrative is really powerful.
Thank you, Marwa. We only have a couple of minutes, either Ramzy or Issam, if you would like to end or say something.
Yeah,
I will concede my time to Issam being in Gaza.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just would like to thank you for organizing this, and thank you for the audience who have been so patient during our long answers. What we have stated, and I mean by me, Dr. Ramzy, Dr. Marwa as well, is just the tip of the iceberg of those stories and those statistical facts, including, and I believe a large, heavy responsibility lies on you, is to try, and this is my final message, is to try to educate yourself the best you can in order to amplify the stories of Palestinians and originally listen to those stories from Palestinians, not from whosoever, US journalist who doesn't or she doesn't know anything about the context of suffering of Palestinians. Of course, with all respect to every effort to amplify the story, but I try to amplify the voices of Palestinians, the stories of Palestinians from Palestinians. In order to understand the suffering of Palestinians, you have to see them as people first. This is the message that I'm always repeating. It's an essential part of understanding the context of Palestine. Also, it's a huge responsibility lies above your shoulders in regard, because you are living in the UK, you're probably living in the US, and you have access to your leaders. I mean, unlike us here in Palestine. So you have originally to approach those leaders who are contributing to the suffering of Palestinians since 1948, especially the UK, who has been, the main reason of the establishment of the Israeli so-called state. And approaching them is a kind of giving the sense of solidarity, the proper solidarity that should be there, as well as the solidarity that the Palestinian cause needs on a daily basis, as Dr. Ramzy highlighted, that we have to keep gathering, we have to keep the unity, we have to keep amplifying the stories of Palestinians in order, because yes, we are exposing Israel, but it's not really enough. It's not really, properly enough for the dismantling of the apartheid regime. So we have to keep going because we have no alternatives. This is all. Thank you.
Thank you all. Finally, I'd just like to thank our speakers again and our audience. And I'd like to remind our audience of our upcoming event next Thursday, a talk with Omar Shakir about the Human Rights Watch report. You'll be emailed about this, and you can see the registration link in the chat box. Thank you all. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.